snow blew sideways, a ghost in the cottonwoods. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of quiet that eats sounds, the kind that makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. And through it walked a woman. Her name was Marble Jameson, but that name didn't mean much anymore. It was just a sound, like the wind. Her boots were split. Her dress was stiff with soot, black against the white snow. She was walking toward a town that didn't want her, a town that had already closed its doors and pulled its curtains tight. She could feel their eyes on her, even from a distance. The eyes of people who had warmth and food and a place to be. Everything she didn't have. She'd been walking since dawn. Wagons passed her by, the drivers turning their heads away. They saw the ash on her skirt, and they saw a story they didn't want to be a part of. A story of fire and loss, and a woman who had nothing left. A widow without land, without a child, without a single soul to call her own. She was a bad omen walking through the snow. She reached the edge of town as the church bell rang, a hollow sound that seemed to say, "Go back." But there was nowhere to go back to. Behind her was just miles of white and the black, skeletal remains of her home. So she kept walking, over the frozen ruts in the road, into the heart of a town that had already judged her. Two boys playing in a yard saw her and ran inside. A dog barked once, then whimpered and hid. Every door was a closed mouth, every window was a cold eye. She finally reached the general store. The sign creaked in the wind, a lonely, complaining sound. For a second she almost turned around. Hope was a dangerous thing, a fire that could burn you worse than any real flame. But the cold was biting deep now, into her bones, and hope was all she had left. She pulled the door open and stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a physical blow. It smelled of cinnamon and flour and burning wood. Safe. Behind the counter, a woman with a face like a sour apple was counting matches. Mrs. Tibbet. She didn't look up. Marble stood there, dripping snow onto the floorboards, feeling like a stray dog that had wandered into the wrong house. She cleared her throat. "Ma'am," she said, her voice raspy. "I'm not here to beg. I can work. I can sweep, or fold, or just sit by the stove until the storm passes." Mrs. Tibbet finally looked up. Her eyes were small and hard, and they moved over Marble's ruined dress, her chapped face, her empty hands. There was no pity in that look, only suspicion. "I remember you," the old woman said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Jameson's wife, from the ridge." Marble just nodded. "Burned down, didn't it?" Mrs. Tibbet went on, a cruel little smile playing on her lips. "Heard you lost everything, even the baby." Marble's face was a mask of stone. She didn't move. She didn't speak. "Well," the old woman said with a shrug, turning back to her matches. "God sends his fire where he pleases." And that was it. A dismissal. A judgment. Marble turned without a word and walked back out into the storm. The door clicked shut behind her, a final, definitive sound. She was alone again. She walked toward the one place she thought might offer shelter. The church. The bell tower rose into the gray sky like a skeletal finger pointing at a cold, empty heaven. The wind howled now, trying to push her back. Her fingers were numb. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. She reached the tall wooden doors of the church and pushed. Locked. Of course it was locked. Even God's house was closed to her. She sagged against the railing, the cold seeping into her, a slow, final surrender. She didn't cry. The tears had frozen inside her long ago, right along with her hope. She just stood there, a statue of ash and sorrow, letting the winter take her. And then she heard it. A small sound, almost lost in the wind, the patter of bare feet on snow. She turned her head, slowly, expecting nothing. And what she saw made no sense. Two little girls stood at the edge of the town square. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Twins. Their hair was a tangled mess, their coats were thin and useless against the biting wind. And they were barefoot, standing in the snow as if it were a warm summer day. They just stared at her. One of them clutched a wooden button in her fist. The other held a broken piece of string. Marble stared back, wondering if the cold had finally broken her mind. The louder of the two girls took a step forward. "Are you hungry?" she asked, her voice clear and strange in the howling wind. Marble could only blink. "You look like someone who doesn't have a porch," the girl continued, tugging her sister along. "No," Marble whispered. "I don't." The quieter twin reached out a tiny red hand and touched the hem of Marble's dress. Her fingers came away black with soot. The louder one squinted. "What's that?" "Soot," Marble said. "From a fire. Was it yours?" Marble hesitated. The word caught in her throat. "Yes." And then the strangest thing happened. The quiet twin, the one who hadn't spoken a word, stepped forward and wrapped her tiny arms around Marble's legs. She hugged her. Just like that. A small, fierce hug, as if she understood everything. "You want a home, don't you?" the louder one said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Marble looked away, toward the locked church, toward the cold, empty street. I just want a place to be still." The girl nodded, her expression serious, ancient. "We don't got a mama," she said, "but our pa needs a bride. We were waiting to find one." Marble stared at them, lost. Was this a children's game? A cruel joke? "Waiting. We know what's missing," the girl said, her eyes boring into Marble's. "And you look like someone who needs someone." The words hit Marble harder than the wind. Need. It was a word she hadn't allowed herself to think, let alone feel. It was a weakness she couldn't afford. The quiet twin tugged on her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Come on, we'll show you." "I don't even know your names," Marble stammered. The louder one grinned, a flash of white in her grimy face. "I'm June. She's Josie." Marble looked from their strange, knowing faces to the dark windows of the town. She had two choices: freeze to death on the steps of a locked church, or follow two barefoot children into the unknown. It wasn't really a choice at all. She followed. They led her away from the center of town, down a winding lane where the snow-heavy trees bowed over them like silent guardians. They walked past a broken fence mended with rope, toward a house that looked like it had been built from scraps and stubbornness. The porch sagged. The barn leaned. But there was a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, and a pale yellow light glowed in the windows. It was a flicker of life in a world of gray. June pointed proudly. "That's our place. Pa built it with Mama before she died." Josie climbed the steps and knocked twice, a secret, rhythmic knock. But no one answered. June didn't seem to care. She just pushed the door open and announced to the warm, dim room inside, "We brought a bride." Marble's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run. This was madness. She was a stranger, covered in ash, a walking ghost. What was she doing here? But her feet felt rooted to the spot, frozen to the porch. Inside, it smelled like stew and old wood. A fire crackled in the hearth. And in the far corner, a man rose from a bench. He was tall, broad, with sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing thick, corded muscles. A white scar split his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of severity. And his eyes were dark and still as they locked onto hers. There was no surprise in them, no welcome, just a quiet, unnerving assessment. June and Josie scurried past him like nothing was out of the ordinary. "This is the widow," June explained to the silent man. "She's got ash on her skirt and sadness in her boots." The man didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just gestured with his chin toward a chair by the fire. An invitation or a command. Marble moved slowly, every instinct screaming at her to flee. She sat, and the warmth of the fire began to creep into her frozen limbs. It felt like a betrayal. How could she accept this kindness, this shelter, from a complete stranger? He placed a bowl of stew on the small table beside her, the movements economical, without wasted motion. Then he walked away, back to his bench in the shadows. He didn't ask her name. He didn't offer his. He just picked up a piece of wood and a knife and began to carve, the blade making soft, whispering sounds in the quiet room. Marble ate the stew. It was the first warm food she'd had in days. It burned a path down to her empty stomach. When she was done, the girls were already asleep, tangled together on a bearskin rug by the fire. The storm raged outside, but in here, it was quiet. Too quiet. She knew she should leave. She couldn't stay here. She stood up, her joints aching. But when she turned toward the door, he was there, blocking her path. He wasn't touching her, wasn't threatening her, but he was an immovable object. "You got somewhere better to be?" he asked. His voice was rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "No," she admitted. "Then stay, until you do." She hesitated, her mind racing. "You don't know me." He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't hardness. Neither did my wife at first. The words were like a crack in the ice. Shame washed over her. I can't be what she was." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Wasn't asking for that." Then he stepped aside, clearing the path. Not to the front door, but to a small door near the hearth. "Room's in there." She turned to thank him, but he was already walking away, his back to her. He sat down on the bench and picked up his carving again, as if the conversation had never happened, as if she wasn't even there. Marble stepped into the small room. It was sparse, but clean. It smelled of cedar and soap. A single blanket was folded neatly on the cot. A pitcher of water sat on a small table. Someone had been expecting her, or someone like her. She lay down on the cot, but she didn't sleep. She listened to the sounds of the house, the groan of the wood, the soft breathing of the sleeping girls, and the whisper of the carving knife shaping something out of the silence. In the morning, she woke before dawn. She stepped out of the room and saw her boots by the hearth. They had been cleaned. The soot was gone. The split seams had been stitched together with thick, strong thread. She went out onto the porch. The cold was sharp and clean. The world was buried in white. She watched as the sun began to rise, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. The girls came tumbling out of the house, chasing the chickens, their laughter echoing in the still air. The man, her silent host, came out and leaned against the post beside her. He didn't look at her. "I'll fetch wood," he said. She just nodded. He started to walk away, then paused. "You know how to make bread?" "I did. Once. Could teach the girls, if you're staying." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. She nodded again. Then she found her voice. "What's your name?" He glanced at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Colt." He didn't ask for hers. He didn't need to. He walked toward the barn, his shoulders broad against the rising sun. A moment later, June ran up to her, holding out a small, crudely carved piece of wood. "We made you a dog," she said. "It don't bark, but it stays." Marble knelt and took the small carving. It was just a shape, rough and unfinished, but it felt solid in her hand. Loyal. She looked at the little wooden dog. Then at the house, at the smoke curling from the chimney. For the first time in a very long time, she smiled, and she realized something terrifying. These strange, silent people were not just offering her shelter, they were offering her a place, and she had no idea if it was a heaven or a trap. The days that followed were quiet, tense. Marble moved through the small cabin like a ghost, unsure of her place, unsure of the rules. Colt spoke in clipped sentences, his words as sparse as his smiles. He worked from sunup to sundown, chopping wood, mending fences, his presence a constant brooding weight in the house. He never asked her about her past. He never spoke of his own. It was a silence that was louder than any conversation. But his actions spoke for him. One morning, she found the water pump, which had been frozen solid, wrapped in burlap and working again. Another day, a new, warmer shawl appeared on the hook by the door. He never acknowledged these things. They just appeared, small acts of kindness in a sea of silence. The girls, however, were not silent. They attached themselves to her, a constant presence at her side. They followed her as she swept the floors, as she kneaded bread with clumsy, forgotten motions. They chattered endlessly, telling her stories about the creek, about the hawk that lived in the tallest pine tree, about their mother. "Mama used to sing," Josie said one afternoon, her voice small as Marble braided her hair. "She sang songs about the stars." "She had hair like sunshine," June added, not looking up from the doll she was making out of corn husks. "Pa says her hair was like real gold." Marble's fingers stilled. They spoke of their mother, Mary, as if she were in the next room. There was no sadness in their voices, only a strange sort of expectation, as if they were waiting for her to walk back through the door at any moment. One evening, Marble was putting the girls to bed. Josie was already asleep, but June was wide awake, her eyes bright in the lantern light. "Mama didn't like Mrs. Tibbet," she whispered, as if sharing a great secret. Marble tucked the blanket around her. "Oh," she said, "Mrs. Tibbet has a spider's heart, all tangled up in webs of meanness." June paused, then looked right at Marble. "Mama said the whole town is a spider web, and you have to be careful not to get stuck." A chill went down Marble's spine. It was a strange, adult thing for a child to say. Before she could ask what she meant, June was asleep. The next week, Colt had to go to town for supplies. He asked Marble to come with him. The wagon ride was silent, the only sound the creak of the wheels and the soft thud of the horses' hooves. When they pulled up in front of the general store, Marble's stomach clenched. She could feel the eyes on them before they even stepped down from the wagon. Inside, the store fell silent. Mrs. Tibbet stood behind the counter, her arms crossed, her sour apple face pinched with disapproval. "Well, well," she said, her voice carrying through the quiet store. "Look what the cat dragged in, and dragged back." Colt ignored her, walking over to the sacks of flour, but Marble stood frozen by the door. "Found yourself a nice warm place to squat, have you?" Mrs. Tibbet continued, her eyes fixed on Marble. "Doing chores for a man who won't even say your name in public." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some women burn down their own homes just to find a new one. A little fire can be a convenient thing, can't it?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Marble felt her face flush with heat. She looked at Colt, waiting for him to defend her, to say something. But he just kept his back to them, hefting a sack of flour onto his shoulder. His silence was a betrayal. It was an admission of guilt. It said to the whole town that he didn't know her, that he didn't trust her, that she was exactly what they thought she was. They rode home in a silence that was heavy and sharp, like a shard of glass. Marble stared straight ahead, the old woman's words ringing in her ears. A little fire can be a convenient thing. That night she couldn't sleep. The house felt different, threatening. Colt's silence was no longer a comfort. It was a cage. She thought about his dead wife, Mary. Had she felt trapped here too? Driven by a desperate need to understand, she got up after Colt had gone to the barn. She moved quietly through the small house. In the main room, on a high shelf, was a small carved wooden box. She knew it was Mary's. The girls had pointed it out to her once. Her treasure box. Her hands shaking, Marble took it down. She shouldn't be doing this. It was a violation. But she had to know. She had to know what she had walked into. She opened the box. Inside there were a few dried flowers, a child's tooth, and a small leather-bound journal. Marble's heart pounded. She opened it. Mary's handwriting was neat and elegant. The first few pages were filled with simple observations about the weather, the farm, the girls. But as she read on, the tone began to change. "Colt is quiet again tonight," she read. "He spends so much time by the southern fence. He says he's just checking the boundary, but he gets a look in his eyes. A dark look. He's angry about the land. So angry." Marble flipped through the pages. The entries became more frantic. "Hiram Blass was here again today. He warns me about Colt. He says Colt's temper is dangerous. He says the whole town is afraid of him. He says Colt would do anything to protect this land. Anything. Hiram Blass, their nearest neighbor, the man who owned the land that bordered theirs to the south." Marble's blood ran cold. She turned to the last entry. The date was almost a year ago. Colt knows. I don't know how, but he knows. He saw me talking to Hiram by the creek. The look on his face. It wasn't just anger. It was something else. Something terrifying. I have to get the girls out of here. I have to leave. I'm afraid of what he'll do. Not to me. To Hiram. Marble slammed the book shut. Her hands were trembling violently. This wasn't a story about a grieving widower. This was a story about a jealous, angry man, a dangerous man. And Mary hadn't just died. She had been planning to run. Had she made it out? Or had Colt stopped her? Suddenly she heard a floorboard creak behind her. She whirled around. Colt stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the pale light from the barn. He wasn't holding a lantern. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel his eyes on her, and on the journal in her hands. "You shouldn't have read that," he said, his voice low and cold. Marble's mind was a whirlwind of terror. The quiet, kind man who had cleaned her boots and built her a place to sleep was gone. In his place stood the man from Mary's journal, the man with the dark look in his eyes. "Where is she?" Marble whispered, her voice shaking. "What did you do to her?" He took a step into the room, and the shadows shifted. She could see his face now, and the expression on it was not anger. It was something far, far worse. It was grief. "She's gone," he said, his voice cracking. "And it's my fault." Before Marble could process what he'd said, a loud crash echoed from outside. Shouting, the sound of splintering wood. Colt's head snapped up, his entire body going rigid. He looked past Marble, out the window, and his face hardened into a mask of pure fury. "He's here," he growled. Marble rushed to the window and peered out into the darkness. 3 men on horseback were at their fence. One of them had an axe and was hacking at the gate, and in the flickering torchlight she recognized the man leading them. Hiram Blass. "You don't understand," Colt said, his voice urgent, pulling her away from the window. "This isn't about you. It was never about you." He grabbed an old rifle from above the mantel. His hands were steady, his movements practiced. This was not a man surprised by violence. This was a man who had been expecting it. "What's going on?" Marble cried, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Mary found something out," he said, his eyes still fixed on the men outside. Something about Blas, about the town. She was going to expose them. That's why she was running. Not from me. For me. He looked at her then, and his eyes were filled with a desperate plea. I didn't kill her, Marble. I was trying to protect her, but I was too late. Blas got to her first. Another crash from outside. The gate was down. The horsemen were riding into their yard. Stay here, Colt commanded. Bar the door. Don't let them get to the girls. He moved toward the door, the rifle held ready. Marble's world had been turned upside down, then shattered into a million pieces. Mary wasn't a victim of a jealous husband. She was a casualty of something far more sinister. And Mrs. Tibbet's poison, the town's suspicion. It wasn't just gossip. It was a lie. A carefully constructed lie to protect a secret. The secret that Hiram Blas was not just a bully, he was a murderer. And he had come back to finish the job. The door burst open before Colt could reach it. Hiram Blas stood there, a cruel smirk on his face, a pistol in his hand. Two of his men fanned out behind him, blocking any chance of escape. Evening, Colt, Blas said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. Looks like you have company. We were just coming by to welcome the new lady of the house. His eyes swept over Marble, cold and calculating. We've heard all about you, he said. The widow from the ridge, the one with the bad luck when it comes to fires. Colt raised his rifle. Get off my land, Hiram. Blas just laughed. Your land. That's what this is all about, isn't it? This land. Mary was starting to get a little too curious about what happens on this land, about the shipments that pass through here in the middle of the night. It's a shame. She had to have an accident. Marble felt the blood drain from her face. So that was it. Not just a land dispute. Smuggling. A secret the whole town was in on. A secret Mary had died for. You killed her, Colt said, his voice a low growl. Can't prove it, Blas said with a shrug. Just like you can't prove this is anything other than a neighborly visit. Now, I hear you've been doing some digging, looking for things that don't concern you. Mary hid something before she left, and I've come to collect it. His eyes darted around the small cabin, searching. Marble's mind raced back to the journal, to the entry about Colt spending all his time by the southern fence. But it wasn't the fence he was checking. He was searching for whatever Mary had hidden. And then another memory surfaced. June's strange words. Mama said the whole town is a spider web. And something else. Something Josie had said, just yesterday, when they were playing by the creek near the old split cedar tree. She'd been digging in the mud with a stick. This is Mama's secret spot, she'd said. She told me to always put a pretty rock here for her. A pretty rock, a marker. Marble looked at Colt. He was locked in a standoff with Blas, a deadly dance of wills. They were trapped. But the girls were in the back room. They were safe. For now, she had to do something. While Blas was distracted by Colt, Marble slowly began to back away, toward the hearth. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She remembered something else, the loose stone in the fireplace. Colt had been meaning to fix it. He told her about it last week. She reached the hearth, her back pressing against the warm stone. She fumbled behind her, her fingers searching for the loose rock. Blas was still talking, gloating, enjoying his moment of power. You should have just taken the money, Colt, he was saying. But you're just like her. Too proud. Too honest. Marble's fingers found it. A stone, slightly larger than the others, loose in its mortar. She pulled. It scraped against the other rocks, a faint, grating sound. Blas's head snapped in her direction. What was that? His eyes narrowed. He took a step toward her. Colt shifted, bringing the rifle to bear. Don't, Colt warned. But Blas wasn't looking at Colt anymore. He was looking at Marble, at the desperate, terrified woman backed against the fireplace. The fire, Blas whispered, a slow, ugly realization dawning on his face. Your fire. It wasn't an accident, was it? You're not a victim. You're a survivor. Marble didn't know what he meant, but she saw her chance. She pulled the stone free with a surge of adrenaline. It was heavy in her hand. Get away from her, Colt snarled. Blas raised his pistol, pointing it not at Colt, but at Marble. She knows something, he hissed. Give me what Mary gave you. Marble stared at him, her mind blank with terror. What was he talking about? Mary hadn't given her anything. And then it hit her. The soot. The fire. Mrs. Tibbet's words. Some women burn down their own homes. They thought she had started the fire that killed her husband and child. They thought she was a monster, just like them. That was her reputation, her curse. And in that moment, she decided to use it. She let a slow, cold smile spread across her face. She looked Blas right in the eye. You're right, she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper. It wasn't an accident. I know how to make things burn. She hefted the rock in her hand. And I know how to bury secrets in the ashes. For a split second, Blas hesitated. He saw the wild look in her eyes, the soot on her clothes, and he believed her. He believed the monster the town had created. And in that split second of hesitation, Colt acted. He didn't fire the rifle. He lunged, using it like a club, smashing the barrel against Blas's wrist. The pistol clattered to the floor. Blas howled in pain. His two men, shocked into action, rushed forward. The small cabin exploded into chaos. Marble screamed as one of the men grabbed her. Colt was grappling with the other, the two of them crashing into the table, sending plates and cups flying. Blas was on the floor, clutching his broken wrist, his face twisted in a mask of rage. The man holding Marble was trying to drag her toward the door. She struggled, kicking, scratching. She still had the rock in her hand. She swung it wildly, connecting with the side of his head. He grunted, and his grip loosened for a second. It was enough. She wrenched herself free and scrambled away, toward the back room where the girls were. She could hear them crying, "Mama! Mama!" She burst into the room and slammed the heavy wooden door shut, dropping the bar into place just as a heavy body thudded against it from the other side. June and Josie were huddled together on the bed, their faces pale with terror. "It's all right," Marble gasped, pulling them into her arms. "I'm here. I won't let them hurt you." But it was a lie. She could hear the fight raging in the other room. A gunshot rang out, deafeningly loud, followed by a cry of pain. Marble's heart stopped. Was it Colt? She had to know. She pushed the girls under the bed. "Stay here," she whispered fiercely. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." She crept to the door and listened. Silence. A terrifying, absolute silence. Then, a slow, heavy footstep. And another. Someone was walking toward her door. The bar on the door began to rattle. Marble looked around the room, frantic. There was no other way out. The only window was small, high up on the wall. She was trapped. She grabbed the only thing she could find, a heavy iron poker from the small fireplace in the corner. She stood beside the door, her knuckles white, her breath held tight in her chest. The rattling stopped. Then, a voice. "Marble." It was Colt. Her knees went weak with relief. She fumbled with the bar and threw the door open. He was standing there, leaning against the doorframe. There was a long, bloody gash on his forehead, and his shirt was torn. But he was alive. The other two men were on the floor, one unconscious, the other groaning. Hiram Blas was gone. "He ran," Colt said, breathing heavily. "The coward ran." He looked at Marble, at the poker in her hand, at the fierce, protective look in her eyes. "You were ready to fight," he said, a note of awe in his voice. "I had to protect the girls," she said simply. He reached out and gently took the poker from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and a current passed between them. In that moment, all the silence, all the suspicion melted away. They were no longer a stranger and a widow. They were two people who had fought for their lives, for their home, for each other. "It's not over," he said, his voice grim. "He'll be back, and he'll bring the whole town with him." Marble looked at the two men on the floor, then back at Colt. "Then we have to find what Mary hid. We have to find it before he does." Colt nodded. "I know where to look." He went to the window and looked out, not toward the road but toward the creek, toward the old split cedar tree. "Josie," he said, his voice soft. "She knows." They found it buried beneath a flat gray stone, right where Josie had been playing, a small, oilskin-wrapped package. Inside was a ledger book. Page after page was filled with Mary's neat handwriting, documenting dates, names, shipment amounts. It was all there. Proof of Hiram Blass's smuggling operation. Proof that implicated half the town, including the sheriff. This was why they were so afraid. This was why they had painted Colt as a monster and Marble as a villain. They were protecting their own dark secrets. "We have to get this to the marshal in the next county," Colt said, his face grim in the pre-dawn light. "They'll never let us leave," Marble said. "They'll be watching the road." "I know," he said. He looked at her, and she could see the weight of the world in his eyes. "Marble, I need you to take the girls. Take the horse and ride west. Don't stop. I'll hold them off here. I'll buy you time." It was a suicide mission. He knew it. She knew it. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We're not running. Not anymore." She looked from the ledger in her hands to the house, her house now, and a fierce, cold anger settled in her heart. "This is our home, and they are not taking it from us." She looked at him, her eyes blazing. "You said I bring things back to life. Well, I'm tired of bringing things back. It's time to burn something down." The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the yard. They didn't have much time. They could hear the sound of horses in the distance, a lot of them. The whole town was coming. Colt tied up the two men and threw them in the root cellar. Marble barricaded the windows, her movements quick and efficient. She was no longer the frightened widow who had stumbled out of the snow. She was a warrior defending her territory. She found Colt's spare ammunition and laid it out on the table. She checked the rifle. She was a good shot. Her father had taught her. It was another piece of a life she thought she had lost. The girls were quiet, huddled by the fire, their eyes wide. Marble knelt in front of them. "I need you to be brave," she said, her voice soft but strong. "No matter what happens, you stay in your room. Do you understand?" They both nodded, their small faces solemn. Josie reached out and pressed the little wooden button into Marble's hand. "To keep you safe," she whispered. Marble closed her fist around it and stood up. She and Colt stood by the front window, side by side, watching as the riders appeared at the end of the lane. There were at least a dozen of them, led by Hiram Blass and the town sheriff. They were a mob, armed with rifles and torches and self-righteous fury. "Looks like the whole spiderweb is here," Marble said, her voice steady. Colt glanced at her and gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Then it's a good day to be the fire." The riders stopped just outside the broken gate. The sheriff rode forward, holding up a hand. "Colt McCrae," he shouted. "You're under arrest for the murder of your wife, Mary McCrae." A collective gasp went through Marble. That was Blass's plan, to frame him, to turn the town's suspicion into a conviction. Colt didn't answer. He just raised his rifle. "Come out with your hands up," the sheriff yelled. "And send out the woman. We know what she did. We know she burned her own place down." Marble stepped forward, pushing the barrel of her rifle through a crack in the barricade. "You want me?" she shouted, her voice ringing out across the yard. "Come and get me. But you should know something first. I keep records of everyone who crosses me." She held up the ledger. And Mary McCrae was a very good record keeper. There was a murmur from the crowd. Blas's face went pale. He spurred his horse forward. "It's a trick! She's a liar! A witch! Burn them out!" He raised his torch. But before he could throw it, a single shot rang out. Not from the house, from the trees behind the mob. The torch flew from Blas's hand. Everyone turned. Standing at the edge of the woods was an old man with a long white beard and an even longer rifle. It was Old Man Hemlock, a hermit who lived up in the hills, a man who hadn't come to town in 20 years, and he wasn't alone. Other figures began to emerge from the trees, the outcasts, the families from the far ridges that the town looked down on. People who had been bullied and cheated by Blas and his cronies for years. They had heard the shouting, they had seen the mob, and they had decided, finally, to pick a side. The sheriff looked from the armed men in the woods to the fortified house and the ledger in Marble's hand. He was trapped. The spiderweb was breaking. He made his choice. He turned his horse and faced Hiram Blas. "Hiram," he said, his voice loud and clear, "you're under arrest for the murder of Mary McCrae, and for about a dozen other things I'm just now remembering." Blas stared at him, his mouth agape with betrayal, then his face contorted with rage. He drew his pistol and aimed it at the sheriff, but he was too slow. A shot rang out from the house. Blas cried out and slumped over in his saddle, his gun falling into the mud. Marble lowered her rifle from the window, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel. Her aim was true. The mob dissolved. Faced with armed resistance and a sheriff who had finally found his conscience, they threw down their weapons and raised their hands. It was over. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the yard filled with a different kind of crowd. The state marshal arrived, took the ledger, and began taking statements. Hiram Blas and his men were hauled away in chains. The truth, once buried, was now out in the open, undeniable. Marble and Colt stood on the porch, watching it all unfold. The girls came out and stood between them, holding their hands. The house was scarred, the gate was broken, but it was still standing. And so were they. Colt turned to her. The gash on his forehead was already starting to heal. He looked at her, at this woman who had walked out of a blizzard and into his life, this woman who was covered in the ashes of her past, but had refused to be consumed by them. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have any pretty words. He just reached out and took her hand. "The girls painted you on the barn wall," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They gave you buttons for a heart, so you wouldn't fall apart." He squeezed her hand. "I think they were wrong. I don't think you can fall apart." He looked out at the road, where the last of the wagons was disappearing. "The town's going to need a new story to tell about us." Marble looked at him, at the two little girls who had called her a bride, at the home she had fought for. She was no longer Marble Jameson, the widow from the ridge. She was Marble McCrae. A name she hadn't been given, but one she had earned, with courage, with fire. "Then let's give them a good one," she said. And as the sun warmed her face, she knew she was finally home. The fire hadn't been the end of her story. It had just been the beginning. If you enjoyed this story of a woman who rose from the ashes to find justice and a new beginning, don't forget to like and subscribe. because everyone deserves a second chance to write their own ending.